So hi and welcome to another video here, and today we're going to be taking a look at Nvidia Reflex in Valorant and seeing whether that's going to give you any advantage over latency here against other players. Now we're going to go through 48 reflex settings, graphics settings and resolution combinations here. That's right, you heard 48, so this is going to be mind-blowing, and you're going to want to grab a cup of tea and a cake or something to eat, especially because you're going to need time to digest and reflect and go over all the statistics because it's going to be crazy. What we're also going to take on board here is whether locking your FPS to something like 240 FPS in 1080p is going to help you or not. A lot of people have been telling me it's going to help me. A lot of people have said it doesn't help me, and I wanted to check this out myself in Valorant. And if you're not familiar with this channel, it's going to give you all the data and statistics to give you the competitive edge over your rival gamers. Latency is key. This is what we're looking at today. So this will give you an advantage and tell you which settings are going to give you the best chance of nailing those headshots first. So this one's run on a 3090 Strix overclocked with a 10900K CPU in stock. It's not overclocked. I'll put a link in the description to the PC specs as well as the maximum graphic settings and low graphic settings that I've used here. And we'll also be testing this on a 3080 GPU, which I'll do later on. I haven't done that yet. If you haven't already and you want to know more about the FPS side of things, go check my other video out that I've done which is dedicated to FPS, because this one's going to be quite intense here for reflex only. I'll put links to that in the description as well. Both of those together are going to give you the best options that you need. So are you ready here? Because this is going to be intense. Okay, so this is how you would normally run your game here with low graphic settings, no reflex on, multi-threading wouldn't be turned on, and you run normally 1080p to get the maximum performance. So this is the benchmark to look at. So we turn reflex on and instantly you can see it has brought down the latency on render latency and game 2 render latency, but a slight increase maybe on game latency here. Reflex to boosted, and again you see a decrease here in latency across the board here, which is good to see. Turn on multi-threading here, we see a reduction in latency as well as an increase in FPS to 1003, which is impressive. Turn on reflex as well, we see again a further reduction in render latency here. Turn on boosted here, we see a good reduction in render latency with a slight increase in FPS to 1006 FPS. So moving on to max graphics here in 1080p, we've turned off multi-threading and reflex again. And you can see here there is a large increase across the board for all latency here. Turning reflex on, the latency is still there and very similar to the off setting. Boosting this, we see again very similar. In fact, we see a slight increase in game latency here. So turning multi-threading on, we see a little bit of reduction in game to render latency and game latency. And we see a good increase in FPS here. Overall, there's too much latency still. Turning reflex on here, we see slight increase in latency across the board here again. Then clicking to boosted here, we're seeing no difference to boosted or on reflex here. So now looking at 1080p with a fixed FPS of 240 FPS. Yes, I have tried doing 237 FPS and a few other options and they came out very similar here. So I've just done 240 FPS fixed here. And what we see here, which surprised me, is with multi-threading off, low graphics and reflex off, we see quite a difference in latency here. I was surprised to see it so high in game to render and game latency. Turning reflex on here, we see a slight increase again in latency here across game to render and game latency. And then boosting this, we see a reduction in render latency, but the other two are still around the same. This wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting to see maybe a reduction. A lot of people have said you'll reduce your latency if you cap the FPS, and clearly here that isn't the case in Valorant anyway. So moving to multi-threading on here, again reflex is off, but you can see here still high latency. Turning reflex on, slight reduction in latency here, but still too high. Boosting reflex here, we see quite a good drop in render latency, but game to render and game latency is still far too high. So flicking max graphics on, turning multi-threading off and reflex off, we've seen high latency in other max settings, and again here we see even further latency, not good. So reflex on, again, still high latency across the board here, slight reduction in render latency. And then boosted here, again, a reduction in render latency, but the other ones are still far too high. Turn on multi-threading here, the final hope here for capped FPS in Valorant. Reflex is turned off, and we've got a slight reduction in render latency, but the rest are still too high. Turning on reflex, again, pretty much the same here, not really changing too much. Going to boosted here. The final effort, and again, the latency is still too high across the board, maybe with a marginal increase in game 2 render here, but nothing to shout home about. So what does that mean for capped 1080p versus uncapped unlimited 1080p? It means that for me, unlimited 1080p here is the king out of these two. There's certainly nowhere near the latency that you see in here with capped FPS. I wouldn't be doing this in Valorant. But let's check out 2K and then 4K. There's still a lot to get through here, so go get yourself a drink. Hope you're still with me. Let me know in the comments if you are. Let me know if you're running capped FPS and now you're going to be turning that off. Be interested to see. Moving on to 2K here, and again we've started with low graphics, multi-threading turned off and reflex off. You can see here, which surprised me, a lower render latency than 1080p, a lower game to render latency than 1080p, and a game latency lower than 1080p, and higher FPS average. Interesting. I expected 1080p to always be king here. Maybe at these higher FPSs, we see a bit of a difference here, as we are seeing here with 2K. Turning on reflex here, we see a reduction in render latency. The rest is pretty much the same. Hitting the boost button here, again, pretty much the same. No real difference here to write home about. Turning on multi-threading, we see a reduction again in render latency, with a reduction also in game to render, and a slight reduction in game latency. So this one is certainly better here, and it also pushes the average FPS up to 1010 FPS. It's an interesting one. Turning on reflex here, we are looking pretty much the same here, maybe a slight reduction in latency here with a slight increase in FPS as well to 1032. Turning on the boosted option here, boosted, we see potentially a little bit of an increase in latency, although it's marginal here, and a drop slightly in FPS. The best option in these ones here seems to be on with multi-threading so far for 2K. Look at the max settings on here, and again we see a massive increase in latency here. Massive being 2 milliseconds, by the way. And we've still got reflex turned off and quite a drop in FPS. Turning reflex on here, we see a little bit of reduction across the board here, but nothing to write home about. Boosting 2K here, we see slight increase, to be fair. In fact, it's boosted it faster rather than reducing it as you'd expect. So again, on seems to be a better option here for 2K. Flicking multi-threading on here, we see again an increase in latency here with an increase in FPS. Put in the comments here what you think is going to be better, reduced latency or higher FPS. Turning on reflex here, you see no real difference. Turning on boosted here, again, no real difference. So this setting here on max on 2K is not really giving us much of a difference here. Moving on to 4K here, the beast, the PC destroyer has been in the past, perhaps not with Valorant because you get quite high FPS in Valorant still. Low settings, multi-threading's off, reflex is off. But we see already quite a high starting point for latency here, especially on the render to latency. Although whether you could tell 0.4 milliseconds is questionable here. Turning on reflex here, we see a little reduction, but nothing to write home about. Turn on boosted here, again, very similar across the board here, no significant differences, although a drop in FPS to 736 FPS from 957 FPS. Turning multi-threading on here, and we see the render latency go through the roof for some reason. Not sure why, that's the highest we've seen yet. With the game to render latency slightly lower and the game latency slightly lower, and a higher FPS of 993 frames per second. Turn on reflex here, luckily we see the render latency drop back to where we'd expect. We also see game to render latency showing a slight improvement, with game latency looking the same and the same FPS really, bar a few more here. Turn on boosted here, pretty much the same across the board here, no real changes. Flicking to max graphics here in 4K with multi-threading off and reflex off, we see again a high render latency. We also see a game to render latency being high and the game latency being high, as we've seen across all max settings here. It seems to give you a lot more render latency as you'd expect to do more work. And the average FPS here pretty much halves for this setting. Flicking on reflex here, we see pretty much no change. Turning to boosted here, we see again no change. Flicking on multi-threading here and reflex off, we see an increase in game to render and game latency. Turning reflex on, we see pretty much the same. Turning boosted on, no real difference either. So in 4K here, apart from that weird anomaly with low graphics and reflex off here, with multi-threading on, which is 4, they are pretty much the same on all settings here across the board. It's not moving as much as we've seen in the other resolutions here. Taking all that into account, if you're still with me, put in the comments if you are, because that has been a lot of information. As I said, this will blow your mind. This is some crazy statistical stuff here. You can see all the statistics here on this page. Now put in the comments which one you think is the best setting. So which one would I run? Well, it's going to be a difference. It's certainly going to be a tie between 1080p unlimited and 2K here unlimited. It's either going to be a 1080p low graphics, multi-threading on, boosted reflex on, or 2K low settings, multi-threading on, and again boosted on. The only difference is going to be between the render latency of 2K against 1080p. Both are, the 1080p is slightly quicker here, and the render time and game latency is actually quicker on the 2K against the 1080p. with a slight increase in FPS on 2K. But for me, I would probably run a 360Hz monitor in 1080p with low settings, multi-threading, reflex to boosted, and that's probably going to give you the least amount of latency in the game looking at all these statistics. If I was running 4K, I would certainly not be running anywhere near max graphics. I'd be running low graphics, multi-threading on, and either run boosted or on. They're both very, very similar here. And you're still getting pretty good latency on that, to be fair, although it is slightly higher than the other settings. So does reflex work? It certainly looks to work in some of these circumstances. I'll be doing it on Call of Duty Cold War. What I think is going to play more of a key factor here is the refresh on your monitor. So if you can only run 4K, you can only run 144Hz. At 2K and 1080p though, you can run 240Hz monitors or even 360Hz monitors. And that maybe be the differential here, especially for pros playing Valorant, will be the high refresh monitors. So I hope this has been useful. It's been a bit of a mind blower. It took me ages to do, surprisingly. I thought it'd be a little bit quicker. So I hope it's been useful, and I'll see you again in the next video. Catch you later. Bye bye.